Are we?
So, hello there, folks. This is Jay Frost speaking to you, of course, from the Philanthropy Mastermind series. And if you've been wondering what we've been up to, we've been trying to keep you in anticipation for this session. We had a little bit of a Zoom crisis there for a moment, but like everything else in the past 3 years, that was easily resolved thanks to our crack tech team headed by Adam. But most importantly, we want to welcome you. And as you filter into the room now, having waited so patiently, I also want to introduce to you our guest today. But even before that, I want to direct you to something that we couldn't even see a few minutes ago, and that's the ability to interact with us. So today you're going to have two ways to do that. And the first is chat. And if you would please go ahead and just look for that right now and let us know you're here. We would love to see that you're with us today. Just tell us your name, where you're from, which part of the country, whatever you want to say, just say hello. Hey there, Frank. Thanks for being the first one to open that up. Eddie, good to see you. So please just keep filling that up. That lets us know that we're not just talking to the air, but talking with you. We also, after that, so hellos to all. In addition to that, of course, we have Q&A. Please go ahead and fill that up with your questions as they occur to you throughout. We're going to store all those up and then make sure that our guest today has an opportunity to answer all those things that are on your minds. And so with that, I'm going to introduce the most patient person in the world, Holly Hull Miori, PhD, CFRE, right here. Thank you so much for being here today.
What a treat to see you all. Thank you for your patience as we work through tech. We're talking about a little bit of millennial philanthropy, avocado toast, and you think we would have tech down by now, but it happens. We're here.
That's right.
I'm so excited to be with people from, it looks like all over the nation. So welcome. And Jay, good to see you. I can't wait for the time we get to be together again.
Right. Yeah, it's great to see you too in this disembodied way, at least, and be able to talk now that we can actually hear one another.
Yeah.
We're going to get back to the avocado toast reference in a second, but first I want to do you a little bit of justice. And for those who don't know your work, just give it a little bit of introduction. Holly, Dr. Miori, has a nearly 20-year career in this field of fundraising and foundation work. She's raised funds both locally and nationally for higher ed, for healthcare, arts, human rights, Holocaust education, etc. She currently serves as Senior Director of Development and Alumni Relations at UT, University of Texas, Dallas, where she's been in leadership roles for nearly a decade now, following assignments that have taken her all the way from United Way and Red Cross to the American College of Emergency Physicians and the Presbyterian Communities and Services Foundation. She also has recently earned her PhD. That means she spent a lot of time writing a dissertation, which I'm sure would turn into something that you can read, but I'm going to leave it to her how much of that she wishes and is able to disclose. But it's probably safe to let people know, just as you were just saying, that you've spent a lot of time focusing on millennial philanthropy. Is that right?
Yep, that is. I know we're going to dive a little deeper in fundraising in general, but also some of my favorite topics as well. So it'll be exciting time.
Well, maybe the place to start then is to explain this reference to avocado toast. So where did that come from?
So avocado toast. So I've been spending about 6 years working on a PhD, then dissertation. And what I really wanted to name my dissertation was, how things are more important than avocado toast, but it's really about millennial philanthropy. So I love, one of my favorite things to talk about. So millennial philanthropy, the next 75 million people. So it's an important topic to talk about in the United States, I think.
Do you mind defining that? I mean,
75
we've
to
talked about
75
it
million.
forever, but yeah, who are those people? From when to when? And
So 1980 to 99, that's my definition. I know sometimes people say, oh, it's this versus this. Maybe you're cutting it off at 82 to 96. But at the end of the day, we're trying to find a definition to wrap our arms around it so we can start really having those conversations. We also have something we like to call cuspers. Some people call them zennials, not my favorite. But we've got something to really start having those conversations so we can start somewhere. It's kind of like major gifts. When we talk about major gifts, someone say, oh, well, my institution does it at 1,000 or 5,000 or 25,000. At the end of the day, we have to start somewhere and build parameters for our conversations.
Right. And I know marketers sometimes have kind of installed those upon us, but they have been useful. So as you just said, 75 million people, maybe it's good to even frame that. So 75 million out of 320 million roughly, right? Mm-hmm. So a big chunk of the population, but also one that is mature because it hasn't always been described that way So, there have been all these kind of nasty references to millennials dating back to when they kind of emerged as a cohort in
Mhm.
popular literature. So, can you tell us a little bit about millennials? I mean, what are they really versus the terrible stereotypes?
There's stereotypes probably for some reasons. The avocado toast and the lattes, they will spend money. There's a big misnomer that they don't have money. Some don't, some do. They're now, if you use the cutoff years that I'm using, they're now 22 to 42 years old. Some have come of age. Some of them have hit a certain plateau. Some of them are elder millennials like myself. And so now they've gotten kids. They're a little older. They've got aging parents or losing parents with that great transfer of wealth. So now we're having a whole conversation as we're tracking this whole generation. And now things are happening to them. They've gotten jobs and they're getting paid well. They're becoming vice presidents or CEOs, executive directors, getting good jobs in all the sectors. And now they're having student loan debt that we can't discredit that. They, especially our older part of the generation, went through the 07-08 crisis. They went and hit certain parts of the market. They remember 9/11. So now we've got to keep thinking about what do we do with a whole generation as we have the great resignation for our nonprofits, but we're also trying to acquire some, philanthropy as well.
I can imagine that, like any generation, millennials have gone through a lot. So while it is generalizing about them, you just mentioned 9/11 as a reference point. That's distinct from what Gen Z, for example, has experienced. What are some of the other reference points that kind of define the generation?
So every generation has its reference points, and we could go and spend a whole day talking about reference points for each generation, but kind of remembering the dial-up, right? I work at a university, I have student workers, and they go, "What's a dial tone?" And they don't remember, they don't know what we're talking about, right? I've got these 18 to 22-year-olds that are on that Gen Z generation,
Right.
but the millennials remember the dial-up tone, getting the first computers, having a pager. Again, some of the younger millennials don't know what a pager is or a floppy A disk.
They're lucky.
So there's that. I know we're laughing about it, but that's true. Like, they're coming of age, so they're very, very tech savvy. So these digital natives. So think about how we're talking to them as nonprofit executives, right? We're here having fundraising conversations. Is everything we do good in paper, or also are they good with technology too? So are we doing website conversations? So we've had these earmarked with technology, but we also have how we talk about 9/11, Katrina. Now we just had COVID-19 and a double social pandemic with George Floyd, the unfortunate passing with him, and that other social pandemic that came with it. Now we're coming out of this double pandemic with a health disparity conversation and a social disparity conversation. How are we as social organizations going to look at ourselves and talk about ourselves? What are we doing?
There's so much to unpack in all the things you just mentioned. And one of those things, of course, is not only individually as organizations, but as subsectors within,
Mhm.
we have different responses to these events and to the populations and how they're experiencing them. So you're at an educational institution, but that's one of the many kinds of places where you've hung your hat. Boy, that's an old reference. I don't know anybody who has a hat anymore. But I mean,
Bonnie.
but the idea that for example, that maybe higher ed institutions experienced, how do we deal with the social element of that double pandemic, um, might be quite different to perhaps how a social service agency
Mhm.
would have done. Is it also true that they were interacting with the cohorts differently, that they were trying to, or maybe should have been trying to talk with millennials a little differently about these issues from maybe the way they would talk to Gen Z or boomers?
Mhm. So we're seeing pretty good similarities from the research between millennials and Gen Z, very social justice. And here's some interesting finding from the research that I found. They don't believe in the big institution, the big box.
Hmm.
They don't identify. So I'm in the University of Texas system. So hanging our hat, if you will, that you like to call it, hanging your hat on a big brand is not important anymore.
Right.
We now have to have the conversation back to say, we can't tarnish the brand. That's really important, right? Don't tarnish it. But the fact that we're a University of Texas system or the American Red Crosses or the American Cancers no longer is important. It's about the impact.
Yeah.
How are we having those conversations while being transparent about where the donor dollars are going? Big distrust that's coming from the government, the Politico, and it gets worse every time we have an election. Doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're now having to come back and say, instead of saying we're educating folks, it's about how we're getting people either out of poverty, getting them access to care, or things of that nature. If we're a university, University of Texas system or things of that nature. So you're having to change it, the conversation. And what do you do? And I know, Jay, you've been really great because you've done work like all over the United States. So whether you're in a small little bitty town, I'm from a really small town in Texas, or you're from a really big town or a big institution with a multi-billion-dollar endowment, all of our conversations have got to change. But we all have to self-reflect, but still not ignore, I'm going to give my usual fundraiser talk, not my academic talk. We still can't ignore our previous generations either. It's going to get complicated.
Yeah, and for those who are showing up just thinking this was a cool title and they weren't really sure what you were going to talk about today, it would be fair to make sure that not only that we make that point, but that that each of these groups are so important to us, but they all have their own again reference points, but their own needs and interests, and they're very important to our philanthropy. And maybe one of those things is also this issue of impact. And David, who paid you a compliment saying how well you spoke about that, also said, what is the impact? And he didn't phrase that as a question, but I will, especially with reference to these cohorts. You've just mentioned the importance of impact versus the importance of brand. And I'm curious, are millennials, in your research and your experience right there sitting in that chair, are they experiencing impact and defining impact differently from maybe the preceding and succeeding generations?
So they want to get their, let's define it a little differently. They want to get their hands dirty. They want to volunteer attached to their gift. So you're going to look at me and go, okay, are the millennials actually even giving? The answer is yes. But they want to, an annual report is still going to be really useful for them. What they give in direct mail, they want to say, those pieces of annual fund that we were doing for a long time, and you go, $25 does this, $100 does this, $1,000 does this. They want to see that because they want to know what their money is. It's no longer the days of like, give me 1,000 and trust me to know what to do with it. That's gone.
So more like heifer, where $100 buys a cow and $25 buys a chicken. And,
they love it. They love it. The whole, and again, you're always going to say, well, I know this millennial, and you're like, yes, we all know that one person, or those like 5 kids. Like, we know those 5 people. But as I'm giving you more the generalizations of 75 million, right? This is the marketing Tom Ahern effect, right? Of like the masses. When we're talking about broad strokes, we're discussing the broad strokes of the 75 million. And I'm telling you from a quantitative and a qualitative approach, the mixed methods approach that I did, you're seeing that they want to see the impact of the dollar. They're big in transparency. If you're not putting your 990 up, you're not going back and doing these annual reports or newsletter, or whatever you're calling it for you. I know every organization does something different. They are very shy to give back to you. They don't like frivolous things. I have a whole section of my research. It's like, they hate galas. They hate them.
No. Can you please talk about that? Because
let's dive in.
Through every organization. So
yeah. And it's so funny because when my nonprofit volunteer hat, like, I'm involved with galas and stuff, which is funny. In some way, you're always like, oh, I have there's like 3 millennials that want to get really involved. And they're like, of course they do. They have a handful that want to still be involved. But those like high ball gown, black tie. I was one on there. I was personally one on Saturday, but my day job was involved. The galas show frivolous spending behavior, right? So I'm not saying they won't come to an event. They want to come to something different. They want to see your impact. So one of my big case studies, BVB Dallas, they're great. They do a powder puff football game for Alzheimer's research, have raised millions of dollars. But where they have been successful is it's not frivolous spending. They can bring their friends. They can bring their parents. They can bring their coworkers. They find love. They're pairing off. right? So there's all this, it's all intertwined now.
Right.
Previous generations were like, this is where I go to work, this is where I live, this is where I worship. It was very, almost like our houses, right? Where now it's open concept. Think
Right.
of our houses like our philanthropy. It's
Right.
all intertwined, all open concept.
Yeah, so they can come in, they can go where they want, which is it. Yeah,
Yeah.
the door is open. That's so
And
different from the volunteerism that I see on websites, though, where it's if you're lucky enough to find a volunteer page at all, then it might say, well, this is the kind of volunteer we want. So you either fit or
yeah,
you don't.
yeah. And which not intertwined. So your volunteering and your administration and your philanthropy, they want to intertwine.
Right, right.
So right now I'm working with a couple of councils, for example, and my council members that are millennials want to help us build out programming, want to help us get in front of the big philanthropists. They want to help us. They'll fly out to other cities for us. They'll do that. There's a difference, right?
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
you've got this whole thing happening where it's very, excuse me, I use my hands when I talk, so like they're very intertwined, but this makes sense.
Right.
Where our parents' generations or grandparents' generation, or maybe some of you are on the call like this, and you're like, this is in buckets. It's in my lane. And
Right.
that's okay, but we have to recognize the generational differences.
When you started talking about millennials specifically, and I said, okay, so let's define it. You said 22 to 40, for example. There's a lot of different stuff going on in 22 to 40, and I know
And
you
life
said
stages.
life stages. So I'm imagining people who go and meet the love of their life at an event versus the people who already have hopefully met the love of their life when they're 40 and they're trying to figure out whatever they're trying to figure out at that point.
Yeah.
Maybe kids leaving the house. That's a very different sort of experience.
Mhm.
So when it comes to organizations trying to engage with people who are 25 versus 40 or 45,
Mhm.
what kind of challenges has that posed as these people share some things in common in terms of what the experience is of being at that age
Yeah.
cohort, but very different in terms of where they are in their life cycle?
So one of the things I think that people haven't really paid attention to, people who are dealing with workforce, people who are dealing with fundraising, is that people are getting married much later. So, and sometimes people aren't combining their incomes together, or so people, you got to pay attention to that.
Right.
So when you're dealing with, and this also gets into women and millennials, they're still giving, but they're giving big, but they're giving alone. Or they're giving, but they've been independent so long, and then they get paired off, whatever that may mean for them.
Mhm.
They're partners, they get married, they got married, but they kept their finances separate, which is more common in the millennial generation.
Mhm.
A millennial who's married to an Xer, I'm personally that. So our giving patterns are very different. We're technically two different generations. So I always try to like push back a little bit and say, you've got a whole generation that married later. The divorce rate's actually lower in this generation. So you've got to pay attention. Well, part of it's because they married later.
Sure.
They're the most educated generation. So they're reading a little differently than the the older generations. So as you're looking at these giving patterns, we're paying attention. Again, I'm going to give my big fundraising talk for a second. We're not ignoring the other generations.
Right.
It's just, how do we get ready for this as a fundraising opportunity, a volunteer base, a board base, right? Boards and councils and committees. And it's a workforce for us. 10% of all jobs are in the nonprofit space. So that's not the main part of my research, but it kept coming up, is we got to pay attention to this as well. I can't fix your interns. That's
Right.
also a big question I get, but I can't quite fix them for you because you are dealing with all the way down to 22, 21, 20 or so on occasion on those cuspers. But how can we think about these things?
I just love that word cusper because I always think of astrology, and I'm so glad we're not talking about that. But we did have a great question from Liza, who had said, "Do these giving trends also track for international students and alumni and donors in general?"
Yeah.
How do you-
So what's interesting is when you think, so international question, because I do work a lot in that market. We don't have enough research on it, candidly, but here's what we do have. A lot of the generation of millennials, specifically 75 million, are more than one race because of the international scene that is the United States. right? We know this for a fact. There are more than one race, more than one ethnic background. That is 1 in 6 persons in the generation. Pay attention to that. What do things look like based on what you serve? I'm going to use a fancy academic term, representative bureaucracy, just a big fancy expression of, do you look like who you serve? Do you look like people in your community? And if it all looks like one background, right? Your people can't give to what they don't see in themselves.
Oh, wow. I'm so glad you brought this up. I know it's not really what we said we might talk about, but do you mind referencing that with respect to the board for a minute? Because, and maybe even events, because people show up at an event, if they don't see anybody else like them, what do they feel like? I mean, we have experienced that in our house, but the board is the same, right? If they don't see people who kind of represent them.
And that comes up from the millennial perspective, right? Because they want to see another they want to be the token young person or the token person of color. And then that gets into the millennial workforce or whatever you're doing, because I've had millennials come up to me and go, well, I don't want to be the only young person, because often they're representing a lot of things, right? Because of how the millennial generation is set up, right? They're most educated, more than one race, more than coming from transient areas because of the international question, right? Or first generation for education. So someone tries to put someone on their board or a certain type of donor because they're doing that because they don't want to be seen as checking all the boxes. They get really sensitive, right? Social justice is one of the big themes that came to my research, one of my top 6 themes. If you ever get to read it. And social justice becomes very sensitive because you go, I don't want to be a token, right? Like I've got that word, right? Like want to be really careful. They want to be part of the change behavior. Bring more than one. They'll bring all their friends, right? That's something we've learned. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, I love that you talked about it that way, because the push for diversity, equity, inclusion, there are different ways of both representing all that discussion as well as that phrase. But inevitably, there's a checking in the box flavor when people try to initiate that, and that's very problematic as well because of all the things you just mentioned. So as you're thinking this through with organizations, and millennials are quite diverse, both as a population, but also within their households. The other box on the census form, that's the fastest growing population in the country, I think still. So what does that mean in terms of organizations that are trying to address that, specifically with this rising generation of philanthropists?
Yeah. So they want to have a seat at the table, but also here's something else. If you want to be part of having diversity, equity, inclusion, millennials will bring it for you by natural default, right? Because of the makeup, the ethnic makeup, the education, where the areas they're coming from, their parents are coming from, but also really give them a seat at the table, not a seat in the room.
Okay.
There's a difference.
Very important way of characterizing it. Now, you just said that there were 6 themes in your. I don't know how much I can ask you about your work, because I know that you may be at some point publishing something. So maybe I should just ask you, what can we talk about? What can't we? And can you talk about the 6 themes, perhaps? If
sure,
not,
they're kind of more in broad strokes, but we can go through them. Technology is a big one, right? We know millennials love technology. I'm going to jump into one of the questions about segmenting appeals. I saw that I can only see it when it pops up on my screen. So I only can catch it a little bit. Segmenting appeals. So one of the misnomer surprises, I know that's one of the things we teased a little bit, is we think millennials only want email. That's not true. What's funny is we can direct mail them, but they're not responding to the paper. We do these beautiful appeals, and then we're expecting them, based on a lot of the qualitative, so face-to-face interviews that I did, that they're then not just responding to our direct mail. What they're doing is you give them paper, they actually read it. Just like a magazine, right? Like you send them Vogue, you send them whatever magazine in the mail. What they're doing is they're taking that postcard, that direct mail, and then they're using your QR code to make their gift online. Are you hearing what I'm saying?
Which they don't have to use, but it gives them, it gives them their.
They like the paper. The thing is, we're bombarded with online messaging, especially it's kind of one of these good and bad silver linings from the pandemic, is that everybody went online thinking like, oh, we're going to save money, or we're going to, but then what happens is, like every generation, we got bombarded with messaging. So what's really making it through, and everybody's going to start using paper mail, right? Is that and all the direct mail companies are like, thank you. Is that direct mail is actually making it through because everybody still likes the specialness of something in the mail.
Sure.
And then I was doing these individual conversations, very long conversations and interviews. And they're like, yeah, I do. But then I take the postcard or I take the letter and then I use the QR code. I only respond if there's a QR code.
Really?
Yeah. And that's the funny thing. And so or I'm at an event, not a gala. I'm at an event and I look for the QR code and I make a gift right there.
Yeah. I'm doing the same thing. And the thing is that not only is it then giving people the avenues and making it easier for them, but it also makes the gift more immediate. I mean, it's just so much faster than trying to,
because they'll forget.
Right.
That's again, I'm giving you the mass generalization. Of course, you're going to have that one millennial, like I still have a checkbook, right? Because I've got kids and I have to do a check for the kids, daycare. But so that's probably your older part of the generation, because you're asking about, there's a big swing between 20 years and a generation. And then you're going to have some like I'm on a college campus, right? We've got 31,000 kids on campus. They go, oh, can I PayPal or can I Zelle? I don't even know all the giving options. They're like trying to do Instacash with us during our giving day on campus for 2 days. Right. They're all trying to cryptocurrency us. So that's really great. And so you've got this kind of mixed bag because we have so many options now. And also, again, I'm going to not discount our other generations too. Other generations are also trying to use the QR code. But who's leading the charge is the millennials, and then the Gen Zs right behind them doing it.
Right.
So, yeah, they're doing it too.
Yeah. It's funny as you talk about this. It strikes me that also, in fact, there's a question about this from Kristen, that these things don't only apply to individuals, but they also might theoretically apply to other institutions we're talking to, for example, corporations. And I know that in one case, for example, I worked with a small organization where they put table tents around. They had a series of restaurants where they were able to employ the QR codes for people they didn't even know. So for acquisition, they could utilize them. But someone was asking, Kristen again was asking, how some of these trends you're discussing apply, for example, to corporate fundraising or foundation fundraising. What are your thoughts on that?
So I don't do a ton of corporate fundraising, candidly, and I haven't done it in a while. But I think at the end of the day, corporations are run by people. Mm-hmm. And the workforce is mostly made up as the great resignation is happening, the great retirement is happening, is being taken over by the millennials. So I'm going to just go back to what I know a little bit right now. And I work a lot with corporations at my day job. And I used to in another life when I ran a foundation, a lot with corporations. So corporations are still being managed by people at the end of the day. And so how do you get their attention? It's still relationships. It's still social media. It's still peer-to-peer fundraising. And so how do we keep having these conversations to get their attention? Technology is still a big part of it. And do they listen to their families? So even if you're in healthcare, they're still maybe being concerned about the arts, because arts is also a personal interest. So you're constantly having to rearrange your conversation and cater to the conversation. So what can we learn? It's constantly the dance, right?
Another thought occurred to me, which is that there you are in Texas. I'm here outside of DC. There are people from all around the country in this call, as well as some international flavor. And I'm wondering if you saw in your research, or if you're seeing in your daily work, differences by region.
Very much so. So I have had the privilege of going out and meeting with other AFP chapters and academic conferences, and we can see, how fundraising is impacted. Our smaller towns are impacted. They're just different. It's actually by size of community, right? And how are they economically handling the last 3 years? I had another, just something that's not even on my bio, a big research paper on COVID-19 and how all the nonprofits were handling it. Right. It was really different about asset management, how big they had an endowment or cash flow, and how they handled the first 6 months. There was a big survey that was done by one of the United Way organizations and Texas Foundation. I really should remember what the research data was. And so we just did this big paper for a budget class I had done as I was finishing up my PhD. And it's interesting who made it and who didn't. And one of the big things was, it was cash flow, right? Having these conversations with our donors about, in the middle of the pandemic, saying, well, we're doing okay because we have this endowment or we have this cash reserve. And you could see really quickly who was having it and who wasn't. But having these transparent conversations, no matter the generation, of that transparency. Remember, we were talking about the transparency with the millennials, but I think we were able to encourage, like push this into other generations and say, look who's surviving and who's not right now. Look who had to close their doors or lay off a lot of staff
Right.
based on these things. So I think that's where the fundraising trends were kind of moving around a lot really quickly. And it also changed our communication style, those that did it well.
Talk about that a little bit. How
So,
did it, or how could it have? Because some
you know,
organizations did well and some didn't.
yeah. And it was also just talking constantly to your donor base, right? Showing what we have, showing what we don't have. Some people may say, oh, they were embarrassed to show they had endowments. Sometimes I've seen that and they go, no, that's a sign of stability.
Mhm.
Keep adding to it. And I think we finally got to get into a conversation. Some of the big leadership gifts I got to work on were showing the families like, this program is not going to do unless we do have stability. We need endowments for this or this. And so you've got to start having these really robust conversations about long-term impact and what we needed help.
There's another conversation about dividing up these cohorts and along two lines. One, everybody talks about because of the nature of our political system, which is red states and blue states.
Mhm.
So politicization, how is that impacting things? The other one is religiosity, and that's more in the academic world where that's discussed about whether or not, if people are more religious, however you
Yep.
define that they tend to be more or less generous. Did you look at that as well, especially
Yep.
reference to millennials, and how did politics and religion play a role, if at all, in all this?
So let's do politics first. We're finding more and more that millennials are more political. They're more politically active. And then we see their giving actually go up with political every 2 years with the midterms and the presidential election. It's actually activated by that. It's actually not one side or the other. It's just the national elections that kind of activates them, if you will.
Sure.
And other national causes will activate the whole group. That actually is very helpful for some of our national nonprofit organizations. Again, it's not because they're a not national brand, it's because they're going into these more social justice NGO causes.
Mm-hmm.
On the religious side, we do know that is a major indicator for giving. There is a whole generation that is no longer seeing themselves. Again, I'm giving you mass conversations because you may go, oh, I know this group's their religion. Yes, I understand that. We're seeing a whole generation that is seeing themselves as less religious as a whole. I'm talking about bottoms and seats in a pew, whether it doesn't, for the Abrahamic religions. And so we're now saying, okay, what's our new indicator for giving? And so one of my master's is in theology. So I also got like really interested in this, probably more than I should have. And so it's been interesting when I've been working with our friends over at Lilly School of Philanthropy and their Lake Institute, which does this. And this is the big indicator. We don't know what the newest indicator is. We can't tell you right now. And all of us researchers in the United States are like, we don't know what it is right now, to give you the top indicator. There's other indicators we can go through and tell you, like no children in the household, never been married, that kind of stuff, the kind of stuff we've been knowing around for a few decades. But the number one indicator for a whole generation is now gone. For 75
million. For a whole generation, you're speaking of the millennials again.
Yeah, we're going back to the millennials. For 75 million, we've lost the number one indicator.
Why do you think that's so?
It's coming from their parents. They want to have this kind of independence, pushing away from a parent's the baby on board mentality. They pushed away. So now they're trying to find their own way. And one of the indicators was they don't want to take their parents' jobs. Like if a parent always worked for this one place, if you notice, they move jobs a lot, and that's normal. They'll may take on their own type of organization, nonprofit. They don't want to do what their parents did. If the parents were really into SPCA, now they want to go over to Red Cross, or they just want to take exact path for themselves. That includes religion. And they're very rarely taking on mom or dad's religion. They want to do their own. And when that comes with that is sometimes they're not taking on a religion as well.
It's fascinating because what I understood of some of the work being done at Lilly still put the foot on the pedal pretty heavily towards if you're more engaged with your local house of worship, whatever it is, you're more likely to give. And I
Yes.
always wondered, is that a reflection of the fact that those institutions are asking more often, or is it because there's something about engagement with faith that causes that? So
It's
do you
probably
have
a
thoughts on that?
combo. It's probably a combo because they get to ask every week.
Yes, and
And
we
and
know
if
that
we did
asking
that,
more.
I think our donors would be like, unsubscribe.
Oh,
Don't you
oh,
think?
well, wait a minute, wait a minute. So let's talk about that, because especially with millennials, because this is another big debate, which is what's causing the decline in overall giving. I know you can't answer all questions, although actually maybe you could, but we
Yeah.
don't have time for that. But if organizations ask more frequently, what we see in list direct marketing has been you generally raise your revenues and you increase your average gift, but you might see a decline in the overall population of donors, right? Is that fairly true? And if so, does that apply to
I
millennials?
don't know. We still don't know because we haven't tested it enough. So I had two big studies, right? One was this qualitative deep dive. It was a millennial based group, BVB Dallas, but it wasn't actually on the organization. It was the individuals within it. Deep dive on their giving behavior, going back again to do another survey with them. The other side of the house was a faith-based nonprofit, but had all generations in there. And they just gave me some great data. So I got to do multi-generational analysis.
Wow.
And really got to see, that millennials don't like galas, about giving and how it impacts volunteerism, down to how many hours more get by giving, how it impacts volunteerism, how many number more hours. We know this is tied together for all generations, but how much better it is for millennials.
Mhm.
It's a lot. Like this is the secret sauce right there. But we knew that from the interviews too. So it's just all these things kind of compacted, but we haven't quite gotten into that quite yet. I haven't gotten quite in there yet. I think it's just needing more data, right? Like we
Well,
haven't done a
so
longitudinal study.
you've been diving into all this information, and which just sounds like hell to some people, but heaven to me, because
Yeah.
you can sort of dive through it and find so many different conclusions. And I'm sure your conclusions probably keep evolving as you see more
Yeah.
information.
It
But
it
what's
has.
been the biggest surprise so far for you?
I think the biggest thing is a couple things. Again, the face-to-face ask is they want face-to-face ask. You think everything has to be done on text and all of
Right,
that. It's not true. I mean, you may get the appointment on text and then
right.
they still want the relationship. And then they don't listen to their parents. They may have respect for parents. Like you're hearing them talk and they go, oh, Jay's the best dad. Holly's the best mom. Like that kind of thing is happening. But then you go, oh, are you following your dad's footsteps on his nonprofits? No, not at all. Like they can't even answer the nonprofits their parents are involved in. Or it was something with puppies. Or I think that was my dad's alma mater.
Is that because they don't care, because the parents don't communicate? Were you able to get that at all from the data?
That's my next round of surveying.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure it out. I
Why
was like,
don't you
I
know
think
one
I missed
another?
something in the interviews. They're very like, just,
Right.
I reflect on my relationship with my parents, but I knew because they took me to the theater. I know which theater, but I don't know outside of that particular nonprofit, like what they give to, right? Like,
Wow. Holly, if you don't mind, for the people who are here, I would love to know if you know what organizations your parents give to. You can put
I
that in
do
the chat.
now because I'm an only child and
Oh,
I have to
sure.
deal with my parents' estate, right? Like there's like a whole thing with this. But I
Right.
have friends who I've asked just more out of a curiosity, right? Because I'm a millennial and this is my research. I'm like, where do your parents give? And they're like, something with puppies and a children's hospital. I don't know. Like, I don't think most millennials know where their parents give money if they had to like take it on. It's kind of funny, right?
It's interesting because assuming that we have a good relationship with the parents, and that's not universally true, then this
Yeah.
is one of the things that we might know, because presumably they give because they believe in the cause. That means that these are things they believe in, not necessarily the place, but the
Yeah.
issue. And if we don't know, why don't we know? And we're getting
Yeah.
some answers in the chat about this.
Yeah, I'm seeing it. It's so funny. And
It's
you know how much
fascinating.
money is coming down. So there's a thing called this great transfer of wealth, right? Like
Yes, yes,
we're
yes.
seeing CFRE,
Right.
AFP, National Council of Plain Giving, like obsessively talk about this, right? 65 trillion. That's what the TR is coming down. We're expecting, like the math might be a little off by a few trillion. Let me throw this around. And I say it so casually, like 30 trillions going down to millennials, right? More or less, we might be off a couple trillion. Like, this is kind of funny to say. So think how much money is coming down to the millennials, right? And because all the CARES rules happen, probably most people haven't dived in, except for like the AFP US Government Relations Committee, which I'm on. And we're like, oh, millennials are getting all this money, and then they have to spend it out in 10 years if you get it a certain way. They're no longer this like 72 rule. Like, you have to, if you get it right now, you got to spend it in 10 years, especially certain IRAs. So now you've got all these millennials who are like, I don't know what my parents did, unless they put it in their like documents. Most parents don't have wills. Like, what are they going to do? They don't know. So here you are, you're hoping the millennials like you, like your organization, you're on the call, right? Okay, I've seen some people say, like, I have the same as my parents, but not everybody knows, right? Like, I don't know where my in-laws give. So sorry, like, hopefully my never watch this, but like, I don't know. So it's just kind of funny to pay attention to all these things. And we go, do 75 million people know where their families are? And a lot of them are also, don't forget this DEI conversation about immigrant families, and we don't listen to them. So those are kind of our two, you're asking the two surprises. That was my second surprise. Like, I don't think they all know. It's not some of it may be out of disrespect, but I don't think some of it's out of disrespect. I think some of it's
they just don't know.
They just don't know. They just having this conversation. It's this latchkey thing.
So, that's data you can't yet gather, but I wonder if in the process of asking these questions, if you also generate data. I mean, because then the sources of that information might go and ask those questions. It's sort of like a question about wills. If, as you said, most people don't have wills in this country, but that can be very helpful for them. That process can be instructional, so they can think about what matters to them, what matters to their parents, what matters to their kids. And I know we had a couple comments in here about this stuff. One was, and I love the Andrew's question, which is, do you see a big difference in the levels of generosity between these generations? Even if they don't give to the same things, are they giving equally?
Yeah. So when I did the big study, what we found out was, so baby boomers are actually giving more, right? Xers are right behind, and then millennials are petering behind baby boomers. But the big study that came out of the BBB information is they were volunteering exponentially more than the national average, exponentially more, because they gave more of their time. Instead, there was no longer the substitute theory. It's saying, like, if you give time instead of your money, there's this big academic thing. This wasn't happening with them. They were giving 5 times more than the national average for an annual gift. This is not your major gift territory. This is
how much of that is a supply part of the equation? How much is demand? So in other words, are they just doing it out of the goodness of their hearts? They're giving more? Are they being asked for more? How much do fundraisers play a role in that decision?
Oh, they don't have a fundraising staff. It's all just on their own.
Okay, that's just what they're doing.
They're just doing it because they want to. Now, part of it is they have a membership requirement to be in this group, but they're doing it even above it. There are some millennials that were even giving up to $20,000.
And why? What's
because some of them were because grandma had Alzheimer's, dad had Alzheimer's, or a friend had Alzheimer's and they enjoyed the organization, or this greater good. Like the greater good was really coming up a lot. But we noticed the more they were volunteering, the more they were giving. And it was extremely causal. It was not, and you don't even have to have an Alzheimer's family member for them to give more. It was very much more you volunteered, the more they were giving, directly correlated. And I've been tracking this group for 6 years.
One thing,
it wasn't like a one shot, like, oh, this may have just been a fluke year.
Right. One of the things I did want to ask you about is the arc of this, because people are, I think they're still, we're still getting older. I know there are some declines in longevity as a result of things like COVID and some health concerns in the United States. But in general, the population is living longer than it did 20 or 30 years ago. How is that influencing any of this? So in other words, if millennials are there and the boomers are still here, we love them, stick around, but does that influence what millennials choose to do, if anything? Will they give or not? Because they are not inheriting right away. They're still formulating their idea about their relationship to the wealth they've amassed and their relationship with their parents. How is the fact that people are all getting older influencing their giving?
So a couple of things to unpack, and this may not be what you're asking, but I'm going to go there because you don't know some of the pieces. They're
Sure.
still listening. A couple of things I found, a whole other research project that I abandoned a little bit but I didn't know what to do with it. We were trying to figure out how fundraisers responded to different generations.
Yeah.
Millennial fundraisers don't know what to do with millennials, but what was it? Yeah. Know what to do with that.
Wow.
But you know who will respond? You know who will respond very well? They like the millennials, like the baby boomer generation. They respect them, not their parents, but they'll respect a baby boomer fundraiser to come talk to them. They see a lot of respect in them.
That's very interesting.
But I didn't kind of know what to do with this information other than, oh, it's kind of interesting. It's almost like a peer mentor. And part of it is because we see in generational research, they see that they had a lot of same things. Like you went through a big war, right? Like this post 9/11 thing. They've gone through a lot of recession. So they have a lot to talk about. They just don't want to listen to their parents. They want to listen to someone else's parents.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No, I
it's
can
kind
see
of
that.
this mentor thing that they see. So if a fundraiser comes and talk to them, or you bring a board member of that generation to come get on the board, remember you're talking about board development, they'll listen to them.
You've talked to a lot of people doing this as well as looked at a lot of data.
Mhm.
And you've also talked to colleagues in the industry, some of whom are probably younger and some of whom are, probably been around the block a few times.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, is this dynamic about looking to people who are, been here longer, as potentially maybe coaches or advisors or whatever we want to call them, wise uncles and aunts, that
Yeah.
I wonder if that's something that's always been true, and if we rediscover it with every generation, or if
I,
this is uniquely true today.
I think it's probably just being rediscovered, and some of our ethnic backgrounds don't have it, and we're finding it for ourselves.
Hmm.
And so we're some demographics are finding it for themselves, and some groups call it aunties, and some people are just creating it for themselves. And I think we have some workforce groups that don't have it for themselves, and so creating it for themselves as well.
Is there a lesson for nonprofits who are thinking about everything from the messages they're communicating to who to assign to go and sit down with people, to make sure that they're giving donors what they need so they
Mhm.
can have a discussion, not just with the person who represents organizations, but within themselves to figure out what is it they want to do? How do they want to be the best versions of themselves through philanthropy?
I think part of it is just we're always looking for we're matchmakers, right? And so just paying attention to representation, but at the same time pairing up so people feel included and how not a seat in the room, but seat at the table. I keep talking about this, right? Like how do you but it doesn't have to be exact. It's just how do you create an opportunity for them to be part of the conversation? You have a whole generation that's going to be coming with means, coming with opportunity, willingness to volunteer, time with organizations, for-profit organizations are giving more and more time to volunteer and wanting them to be on board. So how are we creating opportunities? I'd hate to wait a whole 10 years for a whole nonprofit community to wake up one day and go, we have a whole generation that's not on our boards, not volunteering for us, not giving to us, or not working for us. So that's been kind of my soapbox for several years, is that we haven't created a pipeline.
Right.
And so I think that, but also not, and we've got Gen Z right behind it, that's ready, that's active. They want social justice. They want to give. They want to be part. And I think we're here, and it's about to happen and happen big. It'll be fun though to watch it.
Absolutely, especially if we can be their partners in it instead of
Yeah.
just sitting back and then wondering what happened. But I wonder, as you look at all this, you've looked at all
Yeah.
this data, you've thought about this in such
Mhm.
detail. What is the thing that you're eager to go and study and research and then participate in next?
So I'm actually right in the middle of turning this big dissertation into a consumer friendly book. I'm happy to be part of that. I just signed with Palgrave and Macmillan, and the imprint of Springer Nature. It'll be ready for summer 23. So I'm real excited. Book title to be determined. I think we're still finalizing that. But we're trying to make a very academic dissertation into something much more consumer friendly. So going through a little bit of a rewrite so that it'll be a little more, I don't think you'll want to see all the stats charts.
Well,
I will stick them
some
in
of
the
them.
back. Now, for those that are really interested, there's a lot of stats charts.
So 23. So how can people learn more about that when it comes out? Do you have a list or some way that people can
Yeah,
contact you?
follow
Or-
me on LinkedIn for now. For Holly Hole Miori, and then for now LinkedIn, and then I'll release it there, and then Macmillan's got a whole book series thing they'll do, and then I'm hopefully got a couple speaking gigs coming up hopefully soon, or y'all can invite
do you
me.
know where are you next? Do you have a gig that you're promoting?
Nothing that's formally announced yet. So I've got some AFP chapters lined up, but that's nothing that's been officially announced yet. Just with you, and then I'm always open to talking, flying out.
Okay. Well, yes, you're doing this a lot, and in fact, you were kind enough to do something for the AFP Foundation just recently, talking with everybody there, the supporters of that. It sounds like something you support, or you wouldn't have done that. For our foundation. So for those who aren't familiar with that, if you don't mind, Holly, I'll just put in that plug. You may want to consider supporting our field, because when you do, you end up supporting directly or indirectly the kind of research that she is conducting, the kind of work that she's interested in, and educating our field so we are more intelligent, inclusive, and probing than we've been as a field. So I know I appreciate that, and I'm sure everybody there did. Once again, if you want to know more about her work, I hope you'll follow her on LinkedIn. You'll see her speaking around the country, so be on the lookout for that. And just another note before we leave, which is that I hope that you all will also follow the rest of the series, which is provided, of course, by DonorSearch. We don't talk about them in these sessions, but we are grateful to them. If it weren't for them, I couldn't do this, and we couldn't bring people like Dr. Miori to you today. So we are so grateful for their help. If you're interested in learning more about your donors, I know you can learn a lot about them there, but if you want to know more about that, just go to DonorSearch.net. And while you're at DonorSearch.net, you'll see the resources tab. There are going to be 20 more sessions this quarter in this series. So they won't all be like today's, but they'll all be probing and looking at interesting issues with really, really brilliant people. So I hope you'll join us for that. So of course, please do sign up on the list. But for now, I just want to thank you very much, Holly, for doing this with us today.
So glad to be here with you. And thank you everyone who joined us. And my dog says hello, apparently. So all right. Well, thank you again.
Thanks so much, Holly. Thanks, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
Bye-bye.